All right, good morning. Good. Starting over again. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Istio Workgroup meeting week after KubeCon. So first on the agenda is an item from me looking into release timeline. So I shared this in the workgroup meeting notes as well. I put together set of proposed dates for the 122 release timeline. I was originally hoping to publish this a little bit earlier, but last week everyone are at KubeCon, so this is instead of 20th, this is really the 27th. So please take a look at this. I will post it in the general announcement channel as well, and see if you have any feedback on the dates. If not, then I will publish a wiki, and let's call those the official dates. All right, so that's the item for me. Next, we have Daniel about CNI Z-tunnel namespace choice. Daniel, would you mind taking over? Is he on?
Oh, sorry, I was double muted. Sorry about that. So hopefully this is a semi-quick discussion, but currently we kind of force Istio CNI to be installed in Cube System and ran into an issue with the docs. It's got linked in the meeting notes where you can't install Z-tunnel outside of Cube System when it comes to GKE because priority classes are limited to the Cube System namespace. You can get around it by putting a resource quota resource into the Istio system namespace or moving Z-tunnel into Cube System. Wanted to kind of just bring up a general or get a general consensus on should we treat Z-tunnel the same as we do CNI, where we put it in the Cube System namespace since it kind of also does some things on the host node and might better be allocated or better assigned to that namespace and be consistent that way. Should we add the resource quota to our manifest that we install, which is there's some other prior art, for example, Flux, that does that to get around the priority class limitation, or as Costin brought up, come up with a new namespace that both of these items are put into, like Istio system or something similar. So just kind of want to bring it up and get a general consensus and a unified path forward.
Daniel, do you see any negative consequence to installing the Z-tunnel in Cube System?
I don't. When we were going through the proof of concept and alpha stages, Z-tunnel was for a while always in Cube System, and then some items were removed that removed that limitation of having to be in Cube System, so it got moved back into Istio system. But I don't really see any limitations of moving it back into Cube System or doing the resource quota installation. That neither one seems to have any negative consequences that I can see. Just more of which one do we as a community want to unify under.
Yeah, and just to clarify, it does not matter what namespace either of these go under. What matters is that whatever namespace they go into has the node critical class defined. That's it. That's the only thing. They both need that.
Is there much precedence of projects putting things in Cube System? I don't know how common that is. It sounds a little odd to me, but I just don't know.
There are a number like CNIs. Sorry, you're echoing. It's kind of distracting. So CNIs get installed there. Metrics collectors tend to get installed there, but they don't have to. So it's not unheard of, but it tends to be more anything that has to touch the host node and be a priority, object. Basically, it tends to get put into Cube System.
It's probably not something we really need to have an opinion about, right? I don't care where you as an operator put these things. Just understand that some of these things are node critical, and whatever segregated namespace you've created for node critical stuff, put them there. It should work, right? Whether that's Cube System, it's Istio system, it's my weird thing system doesn't. It really shouldn't matter. So that's kind of where I come down on. As long as those priority classes are defined, I don't care what the name of the namespace is. It's kind of irrelevant, and our stuff shouldn't care.
Yeah, I guess I primarily just bringing this up because we need to have a unified front and make it so that we don't have, or ideally we don't have these weird install procedures. But Costin, you got your hand up.
Yeah, I kind of agree with I don't care where you put it statement. With one exception, I care about Istio system. If we can put it anywhere but Istio system, I will be much happier because remember, namespaces are intended for isolation. Z-tunnel and CNI are super high permission, super important. We already have a bad tradition of putting, we have examples with Prometheus, Grafana, and all kind of crap in Istio system. We already tell people to put ingress and outside the Istio system because, again, same reason. If you have ingress in Istio system, it's vulnerabilities, etc. So any reason to put it in, to keep putting everything in Istio system, I don't know. It's a different chart, different install, different or person operating it. Anyway,
I
that's
agree
my
with
opinion.
that. I agree. Istio system should probably stay isolated for primarily the control plane only. So
And
I
mesh
personally,
config, yes.
yeah, I personally I'm leaning toward moving it to cube system, but that's not the only option. So yeah, I just kind of wanted to bring it up, and especially since GKE seems to be the one that's affected the most. EKS doesn't seem to have an issue installing with priority class set to something other than cube system. So this affects GKE primarily, but it would be nice to have a unified, like Z-tunnel is always going to be here approach, especially since like ingress gateways, we now default to installing in its own namespace when you're doing Helm chart install anyway. It'd be kind of nice to have that same approach to how we're doing Z-tunnel.
It makes sense to me that in order to operate, say, upgrade or install the Z-tunnel, you should need access to the cube system namespace. It's a really foundational part of your cluster, has the ability to break a lot of things if things go wrong. It's privileged. And if every other CNI does it, it seems like that's a sane default. Is it reasonable to provide that as a same default that is then overridable? And if you want to override it in GKE, it's kind of at your own risk. You've got to figure out the priority class problem.
Yeah, it's not too difficult to figure out, but yeah, I agree that it's something that should remain configurable. We should just have a same default.
That sounds great.
Is there any downside to creating the resource quota ourselves in a Helm chart? Like, is some stuff doesn't require it, right? Because I assume it either already has that or doesn't require the quota to be defined. But is there any downside to us just chucking the resource quota in whatever namespace you want to install Z-tunnel into or CNI, and saying like, oh, if you can't install a resource quota here, you can't put these things here, and that's like
not that I could find. With Flux doing it, I would doubt that there's a lot of negatives because. Like I said, there's prior art, but that's something that maybe the Google folks might have better insight on. There was a hand. I didn't catch who it was. But for me, I'm leaning toward cube system, especially given what Mitch input. It is good isolation. Somebody should have that access to be able to upgrade Z-tunnel. We don't want just anybody having that kind of privilege.
That's fine, but I think we should also be pretty clear that like if you don't want to, you don't have to put it. It's not a requirement to put it in Kube system. It's a requirement to put it in a system in a namespace that has the right priority classes. And if you want to do that, if you want to have a different namespace for that that's separate from Kube system and is also for privileged stuff, that'll work too. It doesn't really matter. But we could just document Kube system as a default.
Yeah, and then Costin, to your point, vendors can override that, but I'm assuming that they can also do their own priority class, resource quotas, et cetera, as they need. It's something that can be configured through Helm.
No. My point was that vendors like Google or others are, if ambient is popular and Cineglo owned by default and so forth, it's very reasonable to expect them to handle it as part of the platform upgrade, node upgrade, and all the other stuff, and not treat it as self-serviceable, user controlled or operated component, because CNI, I mean, they do that for the real CNI. They need to test it. They need more control, probably.
Right. I'm not really hearing a lot of pushback, so I think Cube System will probably be the best or most sane default, at least for the open source side. I'm not talking about vendor, which will do their own thing anyway. So yeah, we'll roll with that. That's all I have, Francis.
All right. I don't have the notes in front of me. Who's next?
Peru or zone aware routing.
Yes. Yeah, I think this is the GitHub issue is an old one. We ran into the need for it, and then I see there is an interest in the community also. So I kind of wanted to bring attention to that. So I can comment on our point of view and our requirement. So uh, so it's more from a cost optimization point of view. I see in GCP there is a cost associated with the interzone IO traffic, and we were based on some high-level rough estimations that cost has been significant enough, and to put some attention and chase that optimization. It's in the order of more than 10% of the compute cost. That is primarily probably because of a lot of microservices we deploy and they talk to each other a lot. So I think that's where the primary intention requirement comes with. And to the exploration we have done so far, there's no real safe way to achieve that with the current Istio constructs. The beat, failure priority, all that, right? Because in a steady state, the zone, when routing is considered, uh, there's no perspective taken at the client and server, right? Are they equally distributed in a particular zone to use failure priority and use zone as a first label, right? So that's the closest we have in Istio, and that seems if you use that, there's a uh, mm, there's a risk of hotspotting and skew in workloads and potentially uh, yeah so it will end up causing problems. So given the cost optimization is significant, yeah, that's where the interest is. I see the proposal has a lot of details. I do also see John's comments. Yeah, I want to take the community inputs and see. I just want to bring up the it is very much it adds a lot of value to us.
I have a quick question. How does it relate to ambient also? I mean, if we do, I mean, generally we want to keep things more or less consistent. Will Z-tunnel be expected to also do this kind of stuff for the L4 routing and load balancing?
Yeah, I have limited understanding on Z-tunnel. So when there is no waypoint involved, uh, yeah, I think in our case, I see a waypoint will be there because we are heavily using L7 features. So yeah, it would be a relevant thing because waypoint also can get distributed a similar way. I think it would still be relevant.
No, but if the client Z-tunnel is not sending to the same zone waypoint, then obviously you will have still cross zone and
Correct. So the support will be needed in zTunnel also if we really have to do that. Yeah.
Can I ask a naive question here? How does zone-aware routing compare to locality-based load balancing? Are those similar, or locality won't work in this case because it's not multi-cluster?
Correct. So, yeah, that's a good question actually. So, Envoy is doing a very nuanced way to really distribute the traffic. So when it says zone aware, right? Uh, um, so it is considering how much traffic a particular uh, client client pod should route the request to the same zone. It determines, it sees the distribution of, uh, uh, it needs the distribution of the client service, how it's distributed, all its peer pods, right? All the pods of the same workload, and it sees a ratio, and it also derives. It is also aware of how the server pods are distributed. Based on that, uh, only a portion of the requests are routed to the same zone endpoints, and the remaining portion are routed to the cross zone endpoints. So that awareness, Envoy does that. So this is in the steady state. Whereas locality load balancing, all that, right? Uh, that is more of a configuration, and it doesn't consider the distribution of the of the client workload. It just it's a static configuration. A client should always call a particular region irrespective of how the client is distributed. So that's where the fundamentally they are different.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Uh, yeah, John, you want to comment? On the requirements point of view, does this sound uh, worth exploring? I see. We will try to explore more on how it can be implemented. But yeah, on the requirements point of view, we want to just convey these details. Yeah, John, you can go ahead. I can't hear you.
I think John's mic is broken. That's what he said in the comments.
Oh, sorry, I was not following.
Carson, you have a hand up.
Yeah. So my general concern, I mean, I completely agree. The requirements are great, are very useful. I don't disagree with the requirements. I'm thinking about what is the best way to implement it and to make it work reliably. And the problem we have right now is, especially with both sidecars and with zTunnel, is that we don't really know if we can or we should send to the local zone if it has enough capacity. So we basically don't have information about capacity because we don't use the load reporting, and we don't have any kind of feedback loop about, is the local zone full and we need to spill over to a different zone, or is a local zone still has capacity and then we should send so. But Istio doesn't have this feedback because, again, we don't have visibility into that.
Can you hear me now? Ah, yay.
Yeah. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I was going to say basically the same thing. Yeah. The zone aware, I think, is a very opinionated feature added to Envoy, probably to meet whoever implemented its needs and not much more. It doesn't really map, as far as I can tell, into the model of Istio, which is a bit more generic and doesn't make as much assumptions. And like Costin said, it doesn't actually take into account load. It makes assumptions that the distribution of clients and servers then corresponds to load, which is easy to make when you have opinions, hard to make when you're in Istio and things are much more dynamic and unopinionated. And often like I don't even know how it could be implemented in Istio. It doesn't really map because in the model they have in Zone Aware, it's kind of like a static thing. Each workload is kind of one service, but in Istio, that's not the case. A workload is tied to 0 or 5 or 1 or 2 or a changing set of services. So it seems like it would require fundamental changes to either Istio, which is not going to happen, or to zone aware routing. I agree with the use case of a safer way to keep traffic in the same zone, but I think we should keep it at that and not try and force it in the zone aware routing when it doesn't make sense.
Well, I agree with you, John, but we can still make some incremental changes, and there is a path to make it happen. I mean, again, and who has load reporting service, zTunnel could also probably report load. We could have some way to indicate capacity for each endpoint. I mean, to specify, this endpoint can handle maximum 500 requests per second or whatever. And Istio already has the capability to take this into account and send, appropriate endpoints to workload discovery service to as response. So it's not impossible, but it will take a lot of work, and we need to be careful to do it right.
It
Yeah.
sounds like it would take
So
work on the Envoy side as well, because the Envoy object model is not compatible with, it makes assumptions that we don't hold in the Istio object model. Is that right?
Not really. Envoy is fine because Envoy has a load reporting, and if the control plane is sending the endpoints filtered, then it's not a problem. I mean, Istio can send local endpoints only, or do whatever. I mean, we have ways to control Envoy. It's not a problem in cTunnel. It's just that the
I
logic
think
to
it's more
report
about
load and track it.
it's more about cluster membership, right?
Yeah, but we can control it from Istio.
Okay.
Istio can control whatever is there. So if Istio is in control and send load assignments properly, it can overcome whatever Envoy lacks.
yeah, from ambient point of view, just want to add some one point there. With the waypoint proxy, the number of cross zone calls is going to increase again. In case of uh, the the existing service mesh, where the client and server, they talk directly and there is no hop, right? Now that interaction is going to again go through an additional hop. Correct. Correct.
Well, and really that
So yeah,
demonstrates that that zonality is really, it's about more than networking. You really need zonal aware scheduling. So the given client is typically scheduled close to its services, etc., to minimize those cross-zonal links.
correct. We explored on that point. Kubernetes do have that constructs, but it's a best effort basis. Uh, so yeah, given that is best effort basis, we can't rely on the scheduling constructs. It has to the routing has to be more consider more the current state of distribution of client pods and server pods.
Yeah, so I think the overall feedback is this is a valid use case. It might even be something that it's the right time for us to pursue. I don't think it's going to be a quick solution. It sounds like there's a lot of work to do in terms of optimizing cluster membership, distributing load information, etc. So we could spin this up as a longer work initiative if some of the member companies are interested in contributing, or if we have a independent contributor who wants to push for this. But in the meantime, my advice for your application would probably be to look into alternative solutions, because it's going to be, 6 months on the very, very short end to get something like this available in Istio.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I got that. Yeah, I do. Only thing is, there is some proposal. I will go through more details. John has given some inputs why it doesn't gel well with the current Istio data model. Uh, but that seems some functional thing. Whether it is good for production or not, we will have to explore. But yeah, before getting on to that, wanted to check how community is looking towards it. Yeah, got the feedback.
Thank you for this is valuable input.
Yeah, that's all on this point.
Francis dropped. Whitney, do you want to go ahead and do yours?
Yeah, I can go ahead. Okay. One second. Let me try and share my screen. Yes, so I'm presenting on the release channels again. And since the last time to now, the biggest change that we had was the renaming of the channels. So if you'll recall, previously we had the name Standard, which represented the stable features, and Experimental, which represented everything that was not stable. But we got pushback in the sense that the experimental channel was sort of presenting Istio to be more experimental than it really is. And we explored changing the name, which we did, so that we use standard and stable to denote the stable channel versus like the more extensive Istio that is that includes like all features today. So that was the biggest name change. And nothing else truly changed in terms of like what exists in the stable channel versus the standard channel. But I'm curious, what are everyone's thoughts on the name change? We currently have like a debate happening on the dock itself, where some folks are saying that the standard name, it's a bit confusing now between like standard and stable. But I think the biggest thing that we are trying to do is potentially not use the name experimental and maybe, yeah, just present the channels where users know that if they want to only use GA features, they can use the stable channel. And if they're using the other channel that is like inclusive of all of Istio, regardless of stability guarantees.
Yeah, I'll comment directly on the doc, but I would agree that it seems a little confusing to me. I wouldn't immediately know. I mean, I can see how experimental would have maybe a negative connotation. I wonder if something like extended would make sense.
Yeah, I initially thought of extensive as well. But it seems like everyone agrees with the confusion with the name.
Yeah.
Okay. Is there any other thoughts?
Whitney, I know that you've presented this doc a number of times, and I think you and I have had very similar conversations each time that it's been presented. The channel model feels strange to me,
Yeah.
and usually we're able to talk through it, and you'll get me to the point where I understand why we need channels versus simply having a V1 alpha and a GA or stable API version. But then it goes a week. I don't look at it for a week. We come back and we end up having the same conversation. So I want to apologize for that. First of all, I don't want you to have to explain the same thing over and over again. But I do wonder if it might be worthwhile to really explore in the doc. What are the detailed problems with just using API version? Why do we need to add an additional construct Because I suspect I'm not the only one struggling with that tension.
Yes, that's a good call out. And I will add a appendix on that where I can really deep dive. But at the highest level, these 3 points are sort of why the channel is beneficial compared to just relying on the CRD API version. But this doesn't take the Kubernetes lens. So I will add an appendix that really dives into the shortcomings in the Kubernetes CRD version and model. And thank you, Mike. Yep.
Thanks.
Cool. Okay, so outside of like the names of the channel, which it sounds like extensive might be a more stable and extensive channel, that might be a better way to present the two channels. Is there any other concerns with the overall release channels proposal? Because at this time we have several PRs out that we are hoping to land as soon as possible with the implementations for the release channels. Cool. It sounds like the release channels is mostly approved. I will go ahead and continue getting the official approvals from the TOC members. But I asked that folks spend time like reviewing the PRs. I've included it in the working group meeting notes. And there's one PR that is still a work in progress, and that's the one that is responsible for installing the CRDs using HEM. And hopefully that should be completed this week. And my other topic was promoting telemetry API to V1. Sorry, was that a hand? Okay, cool. Yeah, my other topic was promoting telemetry API to V1. That PR is also up. I asked for folks to potentially review it as well and continue the discussion there. Thank you. That's all on my end.
Thanks, Whitney. Don, did you still want to talk about outbound traffic matching?
Yeah, we'll see what I can do. I'm a bit sick, so my voice is on the fritz. So this is a doc I brought up, I don't know, it was a while ago, that we never actually executed on because we didn't have full consensus and it wasn't a high priority. The idea at a very high level, there's some more intricate details, but it's to align the outbound traffic logic in Istio to behave more like it behaves in ambient, in the gateway API, and Kubernetes in general, which was a bunch of edge cases and whatnot. But the biggest change is today for HTTP, we only match on the host header. So you can do like curl a dash host B and the traffic goes to B. In ambient, that's not the way it behaves, which is for a few reasons, partially because in zTunnel, it is only L4, so we can't actually look at the host headers. Partially because in the gateway API, they also specify that the traffic should be matched based on the cluster IP of the destination when you have a route bound to a service, not based on the host name. And also partially because we had considered going down this route, and so ambient was seen as the way to implement it. Now, going back to why I think we should do in sidecars beyond consistency, is today we don't have conformance with the gateway API because we don't do this. And so we could say that if you have an HTTP route, then we start matching on the IP. But then it's kind of this weird behavior where only things with HTTP routes match differently, and it's pretty inconsistent with the rest. Like you could, for example, create a route that just does nothing. It's kind of a match anything and send to the same thing we matched, which today would be a no-op. If we were to implement the gateway API behavior correctly, then it would actually be changing things if we don't also change our defaults. So I view it as we kind of have three options. We can just not change anything and not be conformant with the gateway API, or we can just narrowly be conformant with Gateway API, but have kind of this confusing behavior. Or we can change all of the behavior, and then we're conformant with Gateway API. We have consistency with sidecars and ambient. But it is, of course, a decent amount of work and a potentially rough migration period. Obviously, we'll do the usual migration warnings, docs, compatibility versions, whatever, to try and mitigate it. But it's not going to be, a trivial upgrade for users that are relying on kind of these niche routing behaviors. So I wanted to see what people thought about this.
I put in chat, but I think the like narrowly conformant where its behavior changes if you add a what would be a no-op HTTP route feels like the worst option.
This feels like an age-old conversation with us where we're stuck between like wanting to make our API conformant or just reasonable in some ways that it maybe wasn't initially, but also struggling with how that will impact existing users. Particularly if we're changing overall the sidecar behavior of virtual services and destination rules so that we can be conformant when customers use Gateway API. That feels problematic because today most of our customers are not using Gateway API. Obviously, we'd like that to change over time, but breaking the existing API that's just going to V1 in order to support the API that's currently in beta feels like a little bit of a mismatch. Or maybe is it less of a break than I'm thinking, John? Is this not as significant as I'm saying?
Well, cluster local is pretty significant, and if we want to, Gateway is pretty opinionated about multi-cluster and semantic of cluster local. So I think I'm next. My opinion, I think I expressed this opinion several times, and I don't think mixing the two APIs at the same time in the same place is a good idea. Namespace or cluster boundary for using one API or the other would be a much better approach. I don't think necessarily migrations are the top priority compared with getting the correct behavior for new users. And I would prefer if we keep Istio with sidecars and Istio with virtual service virtually unchanged, completely unchanged and completely backward compatible and all that, and ambient and Istio with gateway, all that together to be 100% conformant and including cluster local, including all the behaviors of Kubernetes that we break when with sidecars and all that. So you go with ambient and gateway API, you get perfect behavior, and you can turn on ambient by default for the entire cluster or the entire mesh. And if you use Istio API with virtual service, then you get Istio behavior, and that's it.
That does seem reasonable to me. I think we would need to find a way to alert users when they're using both about the sort of mixed behavior that they can expect.
Or prevent it. In the same namespace, you can only use either gateway API with HTTP routes, or you can only use virtual service. Otherwise, we reject one or the other. If you have the label for the injection, then we use, I don't know, we have some ways to do it because we probably want to support gateway API with sidecars too. So we may need some extra stuff.
Yeah. Sumit?
I'm just trying to understand the problem. John, do you have examples like where this inconsistency has caused, like what kind of issues it has caused?
Yeah, if you look at the doc, there's a few examples, unless you're looking for like real world, like this specific user at this company had this issue, in which case I don't think there's any links like that. The biggest issue that I wanted to address, well, there's actually two one thing I didn't go into much is there's actually this other use case that I think is enabled by this, which is the ability to send traffic directly to a pod and have that actually work. That there's a huge list of users that are impacted and are interested in that feature, and it's something that we support in ambient now. But just on the service part, which in my head it's clear that they're linked, but it's hard for me to fully explain why, in my 6th state at least. On the service one, I don't want to say that there's like so many people that are complaining about this, but one of the goals was to make it so that when you go install Istio, less things change and less things break, right? Today you throw out Istio in a cluster and all of a sudden, 10% of your apps are behaving differently. It's, kind of rough. Like, to be fair, like in ambient, we're kind of also really, really, really targeting solving that. And so maybe that doesn't matter, because if you care about that, you should use ambient. But at the same time, if sidecars are really going to stay around for the long term, then we have to, make sure that we actually take care of those and bring them up to parity as well. So.
I think that helps. Thank you.
I would add that sidecars today, I mean, we generate two kinds of configuration, one for gateways and one for sidecars. Waypoints are kind of gateways, and we generate specific configuration for waypoints that is consistent with gateway API and with ambient. We could have a different type of sidecar, let's say, I don't know, gateway sidecar or ambient sidecar or gamma sidecar, whatever you want to call it, and use the same generation as we do for waypoints. So basically, user will choose for sidecars at namespace level the behavior of the new behavior, basically, opt-in.
That doesn't seem terrible to me if we do have to break compatibility as an option. That's better than any of the other options if we do have to break compatibility, I think, yeah. Because that's relatively easy for people to opt into and just say, I want a different sidecar profile, basically.
Yeah, it's not breaking compatibility, to be clear. I mean, it's basically you specified namespace, I want gateway gamma compatibility.
Right. If we have to change sidecar behavior in a breaking way, messaging it to people as you pick one or the other, right? Like it's sort of like gateway class in a way.
Yeah, but we don't want to use the word breaking. We don't want to use the word breaking.
Sure.
We are saying we're providing a new mode. Positively.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
And it does seem like maybe with compatibility versions, we would have a way to introduce this mode as the default in 1 or 2 versions while not breaking existing users, assuming everyone adopts compatibility mode like they should. Maybe that's not a safe assumption.
Well, if they don't, we can say, we told you so, and here's your mitigation. So I think it's actually a correctable mistake of them if they don't adopt it, right? You upgrade.
Yeah, that's true.
I just adopt it, so.
I only bring it up because I was surprised at the maintainer track talk, the number of questions that we got regarding things that have been documented for 3 or 4 years now on Istio.io. Like the questions about not being able to do skip level upgrades. I had a user who was insistent that we don't support skipping versions when we upgrade. That was rolled out in 2021. And somehow that message has not made it to those users. So on the one hand, we could say, RTFM, but I think maybe we might be able to be a little more introspective about how we message these things out and make sure that people are well informed when they go to upgrade.
I have one more point on this subject, or question, or suggestion. I don't know. I've been actually thinking about this for quite a while, so it's not a new topic. But if we go with a sidecar mode that is more compatible with ambient and gateway, would it make sense to have it work like the waypoints, in sense of that, like the sandwich waypoints, basically let zTunnel do the encryption and use AJ proxy and all the other stuff, and basically not generate all the TLS and TLS stuff in the config. So it's basically simplified configuration, relying on Z-tunnel for and assuming there is a Z-tunnel. So you have Z-tunnel, you have a sidecar, and they work together with the sidecar doing load balancing and Z-tunnel doing the rest.
I mean, we could, but the TLS stuff is really the pretty small portion.
I meant ALPN, permissive, all the other stuff. So if we make an assumption that Z-tunnel is installed, I mean, which is reasonable. I mean, if you want gateway, you should have a mix of waypoints and sidecars and
Sure, but
proxyless.
what are we solving though?
A simplification. Basically, in this new mode, we'll have far simpler configuration, far less things that can break. The encryption, all chips compiler, whatever, will be delegated and relegated to Z-tunnel. So it's a much better work from many points of view.
I don't know. I don't know that it's that much simpler. Like the TLS config, sure, it's like 50 lines of YAML or whatever in Envoy, but it's the same 50 copied a bunch of places. So do you save a little bit? Yes, but in exchange, you get a full extra network hop, which is a lot more things that can go wrong.
Well,
like it's not like fundamentally fixing like structural differences. It's an incremental improvement, not a huge increment.
If you think that Z-tunnel will be optimized by hardware and by whatever, and it's going to be super optimal and all that, and probably in terms of if you want to have TIPS compliance or if you want to have settings and user having to deal with TLS version whatever and all the other stuff, it's better to have it in one place and be consistent across the mesh because it's set by Z-tunnel, than having to duplicate and having inconsistencies and having to deal with all the other crap that is. I mean, again, it's perhaps an option that we should have for people to have. If you have Z-tunnel installed, just use Z-tunnel for encryption and don't bother. Or we can keep it. I mean, again, I'm not saying we should completely remove it, but we should have a mode where just like gateways can be in sandwich mode, the sidecars can be in sandwich mode or half sandwich.
Yeah, I agree with Ben's statement. While the sidecar sandwich is an interesting architecture and something we probably ought to discuss, particularly when we talk about migrating onto ambient, I don't think that it's necessary to talk about that when we talk about becoming more compliant with Gateway API. It feels like those can be dealt with orthogonally. Is that right?
True, they are orthogonal, but if someone wants to turn ambient on by default with no option to turn it off, and basically to guarantee that everything is encrypted by the tunnel, it's an optimization to not do double encryption. And I think that's probably the most appealing mode for most users, to not have to deal with that and just say, hey, Z-tunnel on by default, always secure, don't bother me with that. And then again, it becomes double encryption, double inconsistency, that.
Makes sense.
Yeah, maybe it would be best to keep topics isolated because it doesn't really have anything to do with the routing behavior of the sidecar.
That's true, sorry.
Well, John, I haven't had time to read through the doc, but overall, I think what you're saying makes sense here. I'll try to take a look at it later this week. The one thing I would say for me, coming to it with less context than you do, looking at your logical diagram of how we decide where to route, you have a diagram for what you're proposing, but I'm not super familiar with what the existing flow is. So if you were able to add a second diagram to show what we do today so that I can understand the delta, at least for me, that would be very helpful.
I don't think it's possible to express the current logic. No, that's a joke. I think it's somewhere. I think there's already an existing one somewhere. I can try and dig it up. That's a good point.
Thank you.
It's a larger chart for sure.
Is it taken out of a Dr. Seuss book?
There's lots of loops and squiggly lines. Cool. And yeah, I didn't expect any agreement or anything on this meeting. I mostly just wanted to prime the subject and get people to start looking at it and thinking about it. So
yeah, thanks.
We changed. So
Well, I think that's the last thing on the agenda. Shall we let everybody take a 5-minute break before we jump into the next agenda? All right. See everybody in 5 or 10.